I'm Sarah Halter, Executive Director of the Indiana Medical History Museum. Thank you for joining us for our 2021 Glenn B. Mather, MD Memorial Lecture and Annual Members Meeting. I know that many of you are members of the museum, so I'd especially like to thank all of you who continue to support the museum financially by becoming a member or donor. Your support means so much to us. As you'll hear from our board president in just a few moments, we've had a pretty fantastic year despite all of the challenges we still face due to the pandemic. But none of these accomplishments are possible without you. So we're sincerely grateful to each of you for choosing to be a part of the Indiana Medical History Museum and supporting this work in all of the ways that you do. Thank you. Today, we're here to celebrate another year of progress, but we're also here to acknowledge one very special longtime supporter and volunteer of the Indiana Medical History Museum for whom this annual lecture is named. Respected pathologist and IMHM board member Glenn B. Mather, MD, passed away in June of 2009, and this annual lecture was established in his honor. His passion and dedication is still remembered today. In just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to our president, Jane Schultz, who will give a brief summary of the past year. Brief, I promise. But first, I want to invite you to keep in touch with us after today's program. You can follow us on social media. We're very active on Facebook and Twitter. We're on Instagram. And please visit our website, imhm.org, to see new digital content and the latest news and events. If you're not already a member of the museum, you can find out more about how and why to join and learn other ways you can support the museum as well. You can also sign up for our email list to be the first to hear exciting news and event announcements. And you can learn more about the old pathology building of Central State Hospital in which we're housed and schedule an appointment for a tour. So we hope to see you there soon. Thanks once again for being here and for supporting the Indiana Medical History Museum. And now I will turn things over to Jane Schultz, PhD, who has a few brief remarks on behalf of the IMHM Board of Directors.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome to everyone. We're delighted that you could join us this afternoon as we wrap up 2021, treat you to the Glenn Mather Memorial Lecture, and look ahead to next year's activities. I'm glad to report that the museum is open again by appointment and that the number of visitors has been increasing. We have continued our work to preserve our archive of books, instruments, and other materials, and to make it more accessible. Related to that project, we've continued to transform the attic of our 1890s building into usable space. In 2021, we put in a new floor there and built a safer staircase, and we're now able to store non-archival supplies there, space which we sorely needed. In addition to the interior of the old pathology building, we have expanded our medicinal plant garden with some new hardscape and the beautiful Vincent Dagnati Memorial Fountain, which we were able to celebrate with some of you outdoors in September. Thinking about the garden's long-term vitality, we established a garden endowment fund to help with maintenance in the future. And I'm sure some of you have already donated to that. Our programming and fundraising do not stop there, of course. Over the past 5+ years, Sarah Halter has been tireless in raising the profile of the museum through securing grants, and this year has been no exception. Through Sarah's aegis, the museum won a large national endowment for the humanities grant to complete work on our Voices from Central State project, part of which is to continue the online memory forum. In addition to this programmatic coup, we were thrilled to inaugurate the George H. Rawls MD Memorial Lecture Series on the history of minorities and medicine in September. And we heard from Dr. Melody McLeod, an OBGYN from Roswell, Georgia, about Rebecca Lee Crumpler, the first Black female physician in the United States. We anticipate that this will be an annual lecture, and we hope to be able to announce the 2022 event in the next few months. We could do none of this without you, our loyal members and donors. If you're not already a member of the Indiana Medical History Museum and you'd like to be, we'd love to have you. You can accomplish this by heading to our website at www.imhm.org or by reaching out to any of us via email. A silver lining of the pandemic turmoil has been that presenting programs online and having them recorded for later use has enabled us to reach a wider audience, something we could not have foreseen before COVID-19 was on everybody's radar. We are grateful for each and every one of you for your support of the museum, and we thank you. And now I'll turn things back over to Sarah, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jane. Now for the exciting part. I'm going to introduce today's speaker, Angela Bowen Potter. She is a longtime friend of the museum, and you probably recognize her name or her face when you see it. If you've been to a lot of our programs in the past, she's been a popular speaker in the past, and we're very grateful to have her back with us here today. Angela is a PhD candidate and Rosslyn Research Scholar at Purdue University, focusing on the history of medicine and digital humanities. She earned a BE from Purdue University and MA degrees from the University of Georgia and from IUPUI here in Indianapolis. Her research approach comes from 3 decades of work in the field of public history. Her talk today is part of her larger research on the IU School of Medicine and mental illness treatment in Indianapolis. Her research has been published in the co-authored books IU School of Medicine, A History, and Women at Indiana University, 150 Years of Experiences and Contributions. Angela's research connects with the history of Central State Hospital, which went through a profound change during this period, and her presentation today examines the movement of psychiatric research from Central State and the pathology building to downtown Indianapolis. So Angela, take it from here.
I'm really glad to have the opportunity to speak with everyone about my research. Having a research fellowship is nice, that I don't have to go into campus, but it's hard that I don't get to talk to grown-ups very much. So I'm excited to present today on my research. I'm going to be looking at the ways that research moved from Central State Hospital to 2 primary areas in Indianapolis. And you may have thought the title of this program is a little strange, but what I want to show you over the course of my talk today is how research moved from Central State across Indianapolis, and then it moved across the city and around the world. So it's important that we understand Indianapolis's role in this story, but also the spread of this far beyond Indianapolis. So I don't have to tell our audience very much about the research at Central State Hospital before looking at neurotransmitters. So Central State was a leader in biological research related to mental illness. And there was a shift after World War II from neuropsychiatry to biopsychiatry. And here I have an image of from Santiago Hajal of the nerve drawings that he did, beginning to look at the way that nerves were structured. And I think this is very much how we, at least the lay understanding of how nerves work and how nerves look at. So it's been very influential in kind of understanding how we think about the brain. And well, for some reason that wasn't working very well. So I'm going to move on to the first place we're looking at. And the isolation of serotonin, the initial work on this was done here in Indianapolis at the Lilly Clinic that was at City Hospital, what was then Wishard eventually, and now is Eskenazi Hospital. And in 1926, Lilly was working on insulin research and realized how important it was to have a local facility that would be available for doing research. And this is very similar to what we had at Central State, where there was a clinical and research base, but it was also tied to Lilly's longstanding commitment to Indianapolis. So this would provide a facility for the poor to get cutting edge treatment. Now, there's a lot of complexities and ethics about this that we've been appreciating since this time. People who were not able to afford medical care often had to go to charity clinics or were used for doing experiments on medical research. And this is something that changed over the course of time we're talking about. But Indianapolis was the home of Irvine Page, who is best known for his serotonin research. And he was born in Indianapolis. He went on to study biochemistry. He worked with Lilly on insulin in the 1920s, and then went to the Kaiser Wilhelm School of Psychiatry, where he focused on brain chemistry. And in the interwar period, German science was really some of the most influential scientific universities and systems. He came back to the United States to the Rockefeller Institute, and between 1937 and 45, he worked here in Indianapolis. He wasn't very happy with the conditions. The lab was quite small. He didn't have the equipment he needed or the personnel. So he was wooed away from Indianapolis to establish the Cleveland Clinic, and he became the director of research. And as we now know, the Cleveland Clinic has really grown exponentially. So the loss of Page at this time was a real loss for Indianapolis. He would be an influential researcher, and it was too bad that he couldn't stay here. But it tells us a little bit more about pharmaceutical research at the time. Lilly was one of the few companies that was investing in research in a sustained way. They had productive collaborations with universities with insulin and other pharmaceuticals. And so they invested more into this than most pharmaceutical companies. But at this time, institutes like the Rockefeller Institute and the Wilhelm Institute were really the ones that were on the vanguard of research. But Page had an idea of this collaborative model between hospitals, universities, and drug companies that he was able to build at the Cleveland Clinic. Page is not most known in the field of psychiatry, however. He was influential in the field of cardiology. He helped to build the American Heart Association as what it is today. And one of his most important contributions that isn't often discussed was his role as an editor and contributor to Modern Medicine magazine. And this was really important in taking all of the research that was happening and innovations and translating it to the general public or of the general physician. So hundreds of physicians, thousands received this journal weekly, and it helped to be the voice for physicians. And it's really interesting to understand how ideas change. Well, it's really easy for us to Google something now. It was much more difficult to spread information during this time period, particularly to physicians that might be in places in rural Indiana where they wouldn't be connected to the cutting edge research. In addition, we find that researchers in different parts of the world may not have been aware of the research that was being done. In the case of neurotransmitters, there was a lot of work being done in Argentina at the same time as the work being done here in the United States. And so these kind of collaborations were critically important. So at the Cleveland Clinic, he worked with Maurice Rappaport and Arden Green and was able to isolate serotonin. So when we use the word discover, I think it's sometimes hard to know what that means. There's lots of people involved in each one of these discoveries, but in the case of serotonin, it meant isolating the chemical, characterizing it in the serum, and then naming it, and most importantly, publishing this information. In addition, looking at questions of patenting. In the scientific field, people in the universities are often credited for these discoveries, but taking them from a raw form into ways that they can be researched or produced in terms of pharmaceuticals actually takes a lot more collaboration and a lot more time. In the case of Prozac that we're going to talk about later, it took over a decade. In terms of insulin, that was important for Lilly, and also antibiotics. It was over a shorter period of time, a period of time of years. It's also interesting to think about what other groups that serotonin fell into. It was part of a larger group called the catecholamines. I can never say that. But these were also including other pharmaceuticals like LSD that were being researched at the time for possible psychiatric use. It's also important we think of neurotransmitters specifically in terms of the brain, but they were also involved with things like the muscles and digestion. And so that's part of the reason that there's many side effects related to different SSRIs that we'll talk about. And it complicates the question of what neurotransmitters do within the body. So just to go for an infographic, because I'm not a neuroscientist, we know that it operates well all over the body, and it can be connected to eating, sleeping, and mood, cognition, and memory. One of the areas of research right now that is really developing is that on the microbiome and the implications for interactions between neurotransmitters and our microbiome, as well as sleep. This is also part of a larger change in the way that society was looking at issues of mental illness. And while that's outside of the scope of my project today, this is a huge therapeutic revolution in mental illness that we're seeing. There's new discoveries and innovations that are being opened up at all times, or every day. There's lots of articles within newspapers, and also there's information in popular films on mental illness. So there's a real flourishing of interest in mental illness and therapeutic optimism, the idea that things that we can do would be able to change and cure mental illness, or at least improve the conditions. Now, we are commonly, the idea of serotonin seems very comfortable to us, but at the time, there would have only been a few individuals in the whole world that would have been involved in serotonin research when Page when Page announced it in 1947, and they were spread around the world. So it was not at all a common household term like it is now, and did not really become a household term until the Prozac was released.
Welcome to.
So I just am going to skip over for time a little bit about what exactly neurotransmitters are, but I can answer those questions in the Q&A if need be. So the major problem that serotonin researchers ran into was the question of looking at things that are small. So when we're looking at nerves, there's something that's relatively easy to see in terms of microscopy, but much more difficult to look at the chemicals operating between the nerves. In addition, these are chemicals, so they're being metabolizing and changing. When we look at nerves, we're looking at the physical parts of them, so they're not as susceptible to change or degradation based upon on the living body and metabolism. This is also a multidisciplinary field, so no longer a single researcher can have all the knowledge needed for these complicated analysis. One of the ones that's not thought about as much is the need for large laboratories with strong research funding. So grant funding that would only last for a year or two, or pharmaceutical funding directly related to a drug, would have made it difficult to work on serotonin research when they needed longer periods of time and a diverse amount of equipment. And that's one of the reasons that we see Central State as losing some of its early leadership in this area. There needed to be huge expenditures in terms of laboratories and equipment that only universities and pharmaceutical companies were able to fund at this time. In Indiana, the state moved away from funding scientific research at Central State and moved it to the Institute for Psychiatric Research that we'll see here in a little bit. There was also the need to connect internationally because this research was being done by just a few people all over the nation or all over the world. So specifically, we're looking at individual neurotransmitters. And so we're having to get very small. We're needing to look at the changes, the metabolism. And so keeping them cold or otherwise stabilizing them were important. And just the amount of data needed, it's funny to think about, but the smaller you are, the more data that you need. So the fastest computer that was at the IU Medical Center was actually at the Institute in the early 1960s. And some of the systems, the punch card systems that were being used were similar to the ones being used for the Kinsey study in Bloomington. So I think it was sort of an interesting connection between the two of them as they were trying to use these new computers. And at one point, they needed a power source. So one of them took a boat motor from their boat to bring it in to help to power the computer, which I imagine as really interesting. But it speaks to the amount of innovation and jerry-rigging that you see on some of the machines that were done here. There's a lot of unsung women in these stories. And here's one, Marilyn McCammon, who was working on freezing the samples to be able to cut them into small pieces. So we're going to move from Central State now into the two places that this research moved, the medical center and the pharmaceutical headquarters. And I'm going to first talk about the medical center. So I know everyone knows, I hope, where the medical center is in downtown Indianapolis. I've zoomed in here so you can see it a little better. We have LaRue Carter Hospital. That's the diamond-shaped building, and then the Institute for Research right adjacent to it. And then we spoke about City Hospital just a moment ago on the far side of the medical school. So we've got the three buildings there. So the Institute for Psychiatric Research was where the state began funding in 1953 to do the most up-to-date psychiatric research. So moving research from the old pathology building. This was a really innovative step for the state of Indiana to take, but there was many, including Margaret Morgan, who was the first commissioner of mental health here in Indiana, believed that innovation related to research was the best way to eliminate some of the or improve the conditions at Central State and other state hospitals. This was a gamble because using money for psychiatric research, at least in the terms of the state, would mean taking money away from the care of patients at the state hospitals, which were desperately in need of more care. So it's difficult. It was a difficult choice, but definitely one. This is the direction that Indiana went. So here we have John Nuremberger, who was responsible for helping to build, literally and figuratively, the Institute. This was also a modern building and was considered to be a modern research facility. Unlike the old pathology building, you can see it had modern architecture, but the building was not necessarily practical. They put the animal cages on the top floor, which made evacuating the smells and things difficult all over the building. There weren't enough lights in the laboratories. They didn't get enough chairs because they didn't know that scientists sat down, which I thought was really funny. And one of the most interesting little tidbits I found on the building was that there was only a women's restroom on the first floor of the building. And while that's not surprising in some ways, given the gender differences in science, what it is interesting is our commissioner of mental health was a woman. So you would have thought in the building that she pushed for and helped to design that she would have put women's restrooms, but it was quickly fixed. Here we have the initial scientists that helped to start the Institute. And this conference room, many of my oral histories show, was one of the most important rooms in the building in terms of research. People would share ideas. They would bring in wine and bread and cheese and spend the afternoon really wrestling with these big questions. I can imagine the smoke. It was a smoke-filled room because you can see at least two of the men in the image smoking on their pipes. And so that kind of gives us that idea of a psychiatric researcher at the time. I just think this image is really important because each of these men were influential in building psychiatric research, not only in Indianapolis, but across the country. So this was part of the field of biopsychiatry. And this was a transition from neuropsychiatry and a transition between neurologic treatments such as ECT, electro, and lobotomies to what was called chemotherapy or medicines. It was closely connected with the military, with the VA hospitals, and the scientific administration like we saw at Central State. So this was sort of a natural progression from what was happening at Central State into this modern period. We often don't spend enough time talking about the VA, who was really influential in treatment of mental illness. Perhaps a third of mental illness that was treated in the post-war period was from the VA. They were also a large trainer of psychiatrists and psychologists, and often not thought about. They focused on medical treatment, and they believed that understanding basic human anatomy and behavior is the best way to understand pathology. So this is a really different approach from other approaches that looked at the disordered as something, sort of going wrong or studied that part. They emphasized behavior in a way that hadn't necessarily been a focus in the past. It was viewed as outside of mainstream psychiatry at the time, but the more we look into it, the more that it was integrated into the psychiatry across these different disciplines, but not necessarily at the major research institutions on each campus. And it was also because it was interdisciplinary. So researchers were in biochemistry and psychology and often spread across campuses and institutions. So this is two of my favorite things from this. The upper textbook is written by Nurnberg, Forster, and Brady that we saw on the last scene. And it was one of the first textbooks in biopsychiatry. It's exciting because we have a physician We have Forster, who's a biological psychologist or a behavioral psychologist, and then Brady, who was a psychiatrist more on mental illness. The second is an image of a machine that was developed at the Institute. I don't know if you can see, but at the bottom, you'll see a pigeon. And so this was the automatic pigeon feeding and scientific apparatus that they developed. And so the pigeons were in their coops, and then they would be rotated. Reminds me sort of the Rotary Jail in Crawfordsville, if you've been there. And so when the pigeons weren't in the experiment, the doors went down, and they had a problem initially because the pigeons wouldn't get their heads out of the thing as the doors went off. So they had to make it more like a doggy door, but it just shows that not only were they having to develop new ideas about the body, they were also having to develop just basic new machines. And there was a large machine shop at the Institute, which was really one of the more the parts of the Institute that the people who I've done oral histories with pointed to as important in their research. I've done a lot of research on individuals in the field of biopsychiatry, and my research has borne out that they are a combination of psychiatry, neurology, and pharmacology researchers. In terms of the connections, they were well integrated into the larger therapeutic landscape. And there was a lot of similarities between the Institute researchers that I talked about just now, and then into Lilly that I'll speak about in a few minutes. So I think we have this kind of simple idea about balance of neurotransmitters that's really sort of similar to our early conception, like at Socrates, about medicine and the humors being balanced. But the research that we've seen is that it's far more complicated, that there's multiple steps and processes that happen with these neurotransmitters. And so here, to do this research, this just gives you an example how all of this had to be discovered, and each of these functions had to be researched. They had to think about ways they could research them, look at the metabolism, and even develop theories about what the interrelationships between them were. And so this image, after I've read literally hundreds of studies on serotonin, still makes it really graphically clear to me just how complicated this is. This fits into a larger kind of question that's been called the soups and the sparks. So whether our nerves were electrical, where they went down between the neurons, sort of like a telegraph line, or if it was the soups and that we were awash in these soups of neurotransmitters. And I kind of like to think about it as love. We have that feeling of love where we're just washed in love, or we have those electric connections of love. Well, over time, they went to find out that it was some of both. Predominantly, we talk about the neurotransmitters as being these messengers, but there were also electrical sparks that were being sent down the nerves that were activating the system. But these were all deep scientists, but they had information, but not necessarily understanding the way that this all fit together. So one of the most important neurotransmitter researchers in Indianapolis was Morris Aprison. He was well known nationally, but not necessarily well known here. He discovered glycine with Robert Werman. He was instrumental in developing a prominent animal model of depression, and he was recognized for his research in the brain, on brain levels, but also in behavioral research. And what's critical, as you see here about Aprison, was his willing to partner with different colleagues on research. He was influenced by time that he worked in a mental hospital young in his career, and really saw that there might be a way that chemistry could help with this. He was also a tinkerer, so he had spent time during the war with machines. And so I think that's also a part of his success, was his willingness to get in there and try and figure out a way to figure out how to test these issues. But he also had challenges with his ideas being accepted. He wasn't always, could have a little bit of a stormy relationship sometimes with people who didn't share his ideas, and could be, I guess, prickly. But he was really good collaborator and had a number of collaborations that really made a large difference in the field of neuroscience. He's also an example of one of those researchers that doesn't have the top name, but was actually really influential amongst his peers. He might not have been in Time magazine like Page was, but really did some of those small studies that helped to us build understanding of serotonin. So here's Charles Furster, who is the famous pigeon researcher, and the pigeon research machine that I talked about just a minute ago. So early on, there was this idea that if neurotransmitters are responsible for mental illness, we should just be able to take a blood test just like we would for insulin and glucose levels. And it was proposed, and the initial data seemed to support this idea. We can all think about how exciting that would be if you could just find out a test if you had schizophrenia or not. But Aprison wasn't able to duplicate the results. And initially he was, concerned that maybe it was fraudulent. But digging further and further into it, he was able to theorize that it was related to the diet of the people in the mental hospital where Ackerfeld were doing his research. And I think this is really gets back to those central questions, because we know that the diets at the hospitals were not ideal. We know that patients weren't getting the kind of food they needed. We also just now are understanding how complex issues related to the gut and our mental state are. So I think this is really interesting. But it also speaks to this need to continue to repeat research and to validate it. Aprison wasn't very well liked for disproving this idea. It would have been wonderful if we could have had that kind of test, but it was an important building block, and shows that yet scientific advances are not always in a linear line like we might want them to be. Here's another example of Aprison's work. He worked with Werman. Here they were able to define glycine as a neurotransmitter, and it's a critical one, not just for mental illness, but around the body. And Werman went to Israel and started a whole new group of researchers there. And that's the way that these researchers helped to spread the research on serotonin around the world. So I want to switch over to the Lilly labs and talk a little bit about the development at Lilly of serotonin research, which we may be probably more familiar with. This is the Lilly complex in downtown Indianapolis. And while Lilly isn't always a completely amazing, it's a mix there, but they've generally been supportive of downtown Indianapolis and kept a lot of their functions here, even while many other corporations were leaving downtown. So they've been a good corporate partner. That's the words that I was trying to come up with. So Lilly was making news. They were a top pharmaceutical firm. They were known as an ethical drug company, so they put a lot of effort into research. Prior to this period, many of the drugs were not were biologics and they weren't patented medication. At the period when the serotonin research was beginning, they were most well known for the production of insulin, for polio vaccines, and for making antibiotics more available on massive scale, not just a limited scientific development. And so they had demonstrated this ability to collaborate with university researchers. So they moved from an initial small laboratory building to part of the large campuses here. They were influential in spreading science, the ideas of science, while the Institute for Psychiatric Research was rarely covered in the newspapers. Lilly's advancements in drugs were front and center in downtown Indianapolis. So people knew much more about this research that was being done rather than the research being done at the university. So in 1971, they built a new research facility. So you're moving from here to there as part of the massive expansion at the corporate center, where 4 buildings were made in this period. Much of the research that was being done required some very similar equipment and very similar types of researchers. At Lilly, the basic research groups in the 1971 building were organized by research group on different floors of the building. So we know that the Prozac researchers would come together in the cafeteria. So we see this continuity between the researchers at the Institute and here, where they're building these collaborations in shared spaces. And that's a part of research that we don't always think about happening. Now, we very rarely get to see inside of a research laboratory from the time period. We have lots of pictures of outside of the building, but very little pictures of what was happening inside the labs. And it's so different than our modern laboratories. So this isn't at Lilly, who has very much keeps their development private, but it's a really rare example of a research inside of a research lab. It doesn't have any sound. One other thing you notice in here, I think the technology is really interesting, is there's definite hierarchies between the different fields. So we have the technicians and we have the researchers. We also see that women were much more involved in some of the laboratory-based work, but often not given any credit in these final papers and things, and that was seen in every level of this research. And so I think it's really made really clear in this image where we see the scientists, this at quote unquote at the beginning, and then we see all the female technicians working on the projects. All right, so the 3 individuals that were credited for the research are Ray Fuller. He had a very similar upbringing to Aprison. He studied chemistry at Purdue. He worked in a mental hospital. He came to Lilly, and he was really the driving force behind serotonin research, and really was recruiting the others to come. There was, in the basement, we had the animal research. Well, he was looking at different pharmaceuticals and how they were being metabolized and how that would help to understand serotonin movement. So pharmaceuticals were used on both sides by the basic researchers and then also at Lilly, because they allowed for the manipulation of states in a way that was easier than in some of the human trials, which would have been not able to, you can't cut your brain of live humans and test it. So they had to find animal models. Brian Malloy was more focused on the development of the chemical processes and the formulating of fluoxetine, and he took basically an antihistamine and worked systematically through development of models until he had ones that were ready to be done in trials, and then fluoxetine being the one that they found was caused the most change in reuptake. David Wong was involved in finding ways to make it the formula more stable, in addition to helping do some of the measurements of levels. And it was actually Johns Hopkins researchers that were here in Indianapolis that sort of helped provide the key of how to do measurements on reuptake that was able to lead to the finalization of Prozac as the one of these preparations that was most influential. And so this just kind of walks through that. And this is, while we take away all the structures, what the researchers were trying to stabilize and the way that it all fits together. So we can see that this is much more complicated than just the blood test that would have been looking at levels. So I think this drawing is kind of funny because it just shows the idea that at the beginning of this, they didn't necessarily know that Prozac would work. In fact, they weren't even sure that it would be an antidepressant. It was more thought it might be an actual depressant. It took over the next decade to be able to develop Prozac, and this is really sort of outside my time period that I'm looking at here. Empty capsules were one thing that was a big innovation. So it was not only patenting and developing what's inside, but also Lilly being a leader in trying to figure out how to make the pharmaceuticals profitable, but also stable. And you can see this is the pill formation. One of the initial clinical trials on Prozac was done here at LaRue Carter Hospital, but unlike when Page's time, most of the clinical trials were done all across the US and internationally. And as we know, Prozac was just part of a broader revolution in the treatment of mental illness. You can see here before Prozac, just at the end point of our study here, we have a really low level of all of the other antidepressants, and with the launching of Prozac and then the other SSRIs, we see this huge uptake in the number of people in the United States taking antidepressants, this spreading around the world, and now even then to children, and even my dog was on Prozac earlier this year for anxiety. So we've come a long way. We can also see that Lilly has broadened from just Indianapolis to all over the world. And it's also to look at these scientific researchers. You can see Indianapolis at the center of this path, but these paths show where the neurotransmitter researchers that were in Indianapolis, where they trained and where their job careers are. So we can see that Indianapolis was connected by these webs with the researchers involved. I also this is really an important story to me. This is my own journey. I started taking Prozac when it first came out, and one of my children have been on Prozac, and like I said, my dog has even been. So where our story today sort of ends off is where my story started. I was born the same year that Prozac was invented, so this has been a really important story for me. And mental illness is a huge problem in our family, so that's one of the things driving my own research. So I know I've taken a little bit more time, but I have more in-depth information on the web. So if you just Google Potter and Prozacopolis, you'll have all the images and data that I had here that you can kind of explore on your own. So I guess I can take a few questions. I think I went a little bit longer than I was supposed to. Are you there, Sarah?
Yes. Sorry, it's a little slow to hit the unmute button. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I think we have an anonymous attendee who asks, can you speak to the application of the clinical research, specifically the scientists involved?
Oh, yeah. So at the Institute for Psychiatric Research, there was a constant balance between the clinical and basic research. So that was one of the good things about it being at Carter Hospital, is they could, in the one example that I talked about the Ackerman study, they could rush blood or urine across the tunnel and like get it so they could do the studies quickly and freeze it. But as time went on, the clinical trials were more difficult to do. So Aprison, for example, couldn't find a colleague to be able to do a clinical trial for his chemical model of depression, and that was really frustrating. Likewise, some of the clinical psychologists weren't able to find partners at the Institute. The situation between clinical research, the clinical applications and basic research at Lilly is really challenging. We have some oral histories, but because most of those researchers in the beginning weren't pharmacists, there was a lot of tension at Lilly between sort of the product development part, and then when it went through clinical trials and that other part of the company. Over time, there was more and more sort of spinning off the clinical trials from the pharmaceutical companies as a whole, based upon ethics and a whole lot of different reasons. So many of those are good, but it sort of got away from that day-to-day connections that was there when Page was looking at these questions, or early in the 50s, that the researchers like Aprison were able to look at. But I'm not a neuroscientist, so that's my best summary of a really complicated data.
Thank you. That's the only question in the Q&A. I think, Jane, you had a couple of questions that you posted in the chat. Are you still with us?
Yes. Yes.
And while Jane is posing her question, if anyone else has any, please do post them in the Q&A or the chat feature. Either works.
Yeah.
To speak to Jane's question about where the clinical trials were,
Right.
there was a few small scale trials that were done at LaRue Carter Hospital in Indianapolis, but those were just kind of individual partial trials. The full trials were done at 3 sites around around the nation, Seattle, and 2 in the South, I believe. And one of the problems or differences between Prozac and earlier antidepressants and other psychiatric medications was that they were given on an outpatient basis. Prior to Prozac, most of the clinical trials would have taken place in inpatient units like LaRue Carter or Central State. And so that's a big change. And that's part of some of the problems that have, and debates coming up about suicide and other symptoms, is because these trials weren't done in a hospital setting where there could be close monitoring of the conditions and side effects. So that was something that was happening sort of in the broader post-Tuskegee environment of pharmaceutical development. And all of these things are largely advancements, but there always is those trade-offs. So it took a lot longer for Prozac to go through clinical trials. And so also not being able to do them in an inpatient setting sort of led to a less complete understanding of what some of the side effect profiles look like.
Mm-hmm. Did I understand you correctly that some of the clinical trials occurred outside of the United States?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what countries?
Yeah, I know there was clinical trials in London or in England, and there were several different types of trials that were done. So there's some initial limited scale early phase trials, and then there were the later trials. There was also some trials being done in other countries because the process of approving drugs is different for different countries. So we know they come online and, that we get approvals in one country different than others. And we saw that in the vaccine trials recently. So there were some trials that were also done in Europe and in England based upon those markets. Also, there's lots of trials that we don't necessarily hear as much about, such as packaging, stability. So trials needed to be done. One of the things about Prozac was that it was easier to administer and it wasn't needed in the hospital, but those kind of things had to be worked out. There was some initial problems with it being stable, and that was one of the parts that one of the contributions of David Wong.
Mhm. Yeah, just as a quick follow-up, Angie, I was curious to know, especially for the local trials, the ones that we do have records of, what can be said about the demographics of those who participated in the trials, according to gender, age,
Yeah,
all that kind of thing.
so the trials in Indianapolis, we don't know very much about. The Dr. Smalls, Joy Smalls, did those trials. I can't speak to the Lilly clinic where that continued during this time period. In the late 1970s, there were congressional investigations because trials were being done with individuals who were homeless and with poverty. And so there was an outcry about that because, if there were problems with the trials, then these people were being, they were seen to be as being coerced or, having, at the least, these drug being kind of coerced into these situations based upon their ability to pay for healthcare. Lilly addressed those issues and made, a more long-term commitment to providing indigent care, but being also rational about that when it moved to University Hospital. So this was definitely part of also why Lilly stopped doing a lot of their own clinical trials and started contracting with physicians and physicians' offices and facilities that specialized in clinical trials.
Thanks. Yeah.
But like I said, like the clinical work on Prozac is sort of outside of the time period that I'm researching, but it's definitely been really interesting because there's a lot of oral histories that have been done, particularly with people not in the United States. I think there's more reticence about people in the United States to talk about the development, but I think that's one of the exciting things about the Oral History Project that the museum is doing is that we have a chance to capture some of those stories, not only the physicians whose stories usually get captured, but also nurses, technicians, social workers, and all the other people involved with these projects.
See, you sort of touched on this, but someone asks, has your research gone beyond 1975 at all?
It has to some degree. Obviously, people don't just die off when my study happens, so I can't be like, okay, I'm sorry, Dr. Aprison, but you're done. Like, so yes, of course they do go on further, and I think it's a really interesting time period, and it was sort of Prozac was just one of the reasons why I stopped my research where I did in that 1970s period. But a lot of these institutions continued, all of them did, and so they definitely have more history, and I think it's really exciting research, and everyone involved tells me to quit looking keep looking at the research and just finish my project so that it can be done. But yeah, it's definitely something that I find fascinating, especially the connections with the VA, with all of this, these research and how we can understand how the VA fits in.
Dr. Schmetzer is here with us, and he asks, do you agree that we did learn from the earlier history you discussed, the old pathology building, the cooperation between Carter Hospital and the Institute for Psychiatric Research and the Neurosciences building at Methodist all seem to rely on this basic model of collaboration?
I think it's really important, and I think I've come to appreciate that more when I started trying to understand biopsychiatry. It is, these collaborations are wonderful and really the only way that some of this research could get done, because you just needed those different types of research. You know, was so exciting when you hear about Dr. Aprison meeting with Forster and him being really intrigued by the pigeon and that collaboration that was so important. I really think that the model of that we see at like the Cleveland Clinic, or we saw in Indianapolis, of this collaboration between the university and the different parts working all together, really led to this innovation. And when there start to be more barriers placed between this in terms of like grants or some of these other issues, we do see some of that collaboration fall apart. And this sort of bigger picture, but what I'm arguing in my project is that there's this polycentric model of that's really important. We usually think about not having competition and blaming the United States for all this overlap. But what I found in the research is this polycentric model where we have lots of people doing things in a relatively small environment, and there is overlap, actually allows for much more, much quicker research, much more innovation. So it's not necessarily that that people doing the same thing was competition. Just like we see in this example, these researchers are less than 3 miles apart and they're working independently, but overall, more research got done than would have with one or the other individually. But I can't, our mental health system is so complex, and the more I research into it, the more I understand the complexity. And we don't think about how mental illness during this time period represented, approximately a third of medical expenditures, and even more so when you start to think about outpatient treatment. So it's a really complex, and I got to speak in London at the Wellcome Trust about the subject last weekend, I guess, or last 2 weeks ago. And it was really interesting because they have a much simpler system there and much less overlap. And they were just they found it horrifying that we had so many hospitals right next to each other. And why were they, why was the VA here and the state hospital and a private hospital? And so it was pointed out to me again, number one, how unique Indianapolis is and having it all right there to look at, but also just how different it is. I'm used to Indianapolis, so it's definitely not like here everywhere else.
We have one more question from Bill, and he starts by saying, excellent job. As usual, shows a great deal of research. You definitely show that the research was complicated. I heartily agree. But he goes on to say, but it does not seem that Indianapolis was that crucial, i.e. Lilly did not cooperate much with IPR and did its trials mostly everywhere else. Were there other companies developing serotonin drugs at other places? You kind of touched on this, but
yeah. So one of the changes with Prozac that we found was a change from sort of the accidental discovery model where that we see for earlier pharmaceuticals, and not exclusively, but the systematic creation of new drugs that were similar to older drugs, and then or similar to drugs that were known to work in an area, and then systematically looking to see which of those had the most effect on the targeted neurotransmitters, and also the least side effects, and were also stable. And so that winnowing process that got started with salvarsan and syphilis sort of ramps up into overdrive. So that's why the SSRIs look the way they were. So whether Indianapolis was crucial or not, I think, we can't argue counter history. Lilly was certainly crucial, and the Institute was certainly crucial, but that overlapping polycentric model, I think, holds the best understanding. No place is singly responsible, and the best case for that is insulin. The university researchers in Canada often get all of the credit and clues. Here in Indianapolis, Lilly was so responsible for the ability to produce it and to make the innovations needed to make it available. And the pharmaceutical companies don't win Nobel Prizes and aren't largely rewarded in the same way that these university researchers are. So I think that's where the story, understanding the complexity of the story, comes from, is understanding those little pieces that help to make it something that everyone can have. We know that from antibiotics and any of these innovations, that it's not just one clinical trial or one discovery, but actually all these little discoveries that make it possible. So Prozac wouldn't be Prozac without the gelatin capsules that it's in, which Lilly innovated on, and the fact that the Prozac, they were colored and not clear. So the image I showed Lilly's in the beginning made their capsules clear, so you could see that what was in them. And so with Prozac is an example where the packaging came part of the branding, and so the fact that if you show the yellow and green pill, even people who haven't taken it would probably know what it was.
We do have one final answer or question, not answer, that just popped up in the chat a minute ago. And maybe we'll make this the last one. But Harriet is curious about your knowledge about the clinical trials at Lilly in Indianapolis from the late 70s until Prozac was approved and launched.
So yeah, I know that there were just very small number of Prozac clinical trials. I know there were other clinical trials done at Lilly Clinic and related, but those were more small scale or early trials. I do know that LaRue Carter was influential and did a number of clinical trials, but they were not closely affiliated with Lilly. So I think that's sort of an interesting thing about the Institute, in a way that the Institute probably turned out very different than if Lilly would have been involved with it. So it was, drawing funding from the state and from the university and federal grants, it went a different path than the Lilly research did. So yeah, I'm more familiar with the clinical trials that were done at LaRue Carter. We also think about those pre-approval clinical trials, but there's also a lot of work that needs to be done on what's the optimum dosage of a medication, how it should be prescribed in a different for different populations. And so those kind of clinical trials are ones that are really influential, and we don't really talk about that much. For example, lithium trials were done at the VA in terms of how to administer lithium and effectiveness and things like that for schizophrenia. And so that was really important in sort of the broadening of the use of lithium for schizophrenia. So it also is a really difficult literature because there's some of it that's sort of in the pharmacy side journals and some of it's more in the medical side journals. And it just really speaks to the closer we get to the present, the more difficult it is to do really in-depth research. Like when we're talking about the period prior to this, we're looking at one or two researchers and they're doing one or two topics. And, by the end of the time period, I'm talking about, we're talking about, I traced over 100 researchers for the project and we've got multiple facilities and multiple drugs and projects. So you really see just in the short time between when Central State was operating and when Prozac were the pathology lab, not Central State, the pathology lab, then there's just this explosion where you can no longer really count on one hand the number of people involved in the project. I have to apologize to my mom went into the hospital. She had a stroke and she's passed away in the last few minutes. So I'm sorry if I've been a little more stumbly on my words. It's been a rough day. Dementia and mental illness run in our family, so this research is really important to me, and I think it's really important that we're able to talk about these questions related to mental illness, and I'm really excited for the opportunity to share my research, although lots of people in the audience probably know more about it than I do.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here to share this with us, and we will let you go. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to all our members for your support.